Welcome to the LEA Private Nonprofit Equitable Services Random Validation Training. For the PNP Random Validation, TEA will request documentation for one selected program requirement. However, a district must ensure it has documentation on file for all PNP program requirements. This section will provide a brief overview of the LEA PNP Equitable Services Program purpose and the indicator that will be validated. This presentation is intended solely to provide general information and guidance to Texas ESCs, LEAs, and participating private schools, and reflects the Texas Education Agency's current understanding of statute and applicable federal guidance. The content of this presentation is subject to change as a result of further potential information and guidance provided by federal agencies with regulatory oversight of these programs. This presentation does not constitute legal advice, and entities are, therefore, advised to seek legal counsel regarding the information and guidance provided in this presentation before acting on such information and guidance. Documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. To ensure overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. The documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. Given the increased use of virtual meeting environments, participant rosters that include the meeting title, meeting date, and stakeholder names and roles would be acceptable substitutes for the more traditional sign-in sheets. This eliminates the need of a participant signature. LEA should review the Random Validation Handbook for each validation requirement. LEAs will complete applicable sections, include relevant documentation, and follow the Random Validation Handbook instructions to submit documentation through the Federal Program Compliance Division's Work app by the due date. The ESA statutory requirement for the PNP Title I Part A administration amounts is as followed. For Title I Part A programs, it's in Section 1117. A, 4A, expenditures and the determination. Expenditures for educational services and other benefits to eligible private school children shall be equal to the proportion of funds allocated to participating school attendance areas based on the number of children from low-income families who attend private schools. The proportional share of funds shall be determined based on the total amount of funds received by the LEA under this part prior to any allowable expenditures or transfers by the district. The ESA statutory requirement for the PNP Title VIII administration amounts are as follows. You can find the description in Section 8501, A4, letters A through B. Expenditures for educational services and other benefits provided for eligible private school children, their teachers, and other educational personnel serving those children shall be equal, taking into account the number and educational needs of the children to be served, to the expenditures for participating public school children. Funds allocated to an LEA for educational services and other benefits to eligible private school children shall be obligated in the fiscal year for which the funds are received by the agency. You may also see the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 34, Subtitle B, for additional information. Assurances relating to Title I Part 8 programs. The size and scope of the equitable services to be provided to the eligible private school children, the proportion of funds that is allocated for such services, and how that proportion of funds is determined. In addition, the LEA assures it will keep documentation of program descriptions, allowable activities, and expenditures locally and make available upon TEA request for all applicable private nonprofit requirements in sections 1117 and 8501. TEA may request a description of services and use of funds documentation later through compliance reports or other TEA reports. You may find that information in the ESA Consolidated Application, PNP Program-Specific Provisions and Assurances. Assurances relating to Title VIII programs. The LEA will comply with the uniform provisions for providing services to private schools as specified in Title VIII, Part F, Subpart 1, Private Schools, Sections 8501 through 8504. LEAs may find this information also in the ESA Consolidated Applications, Program-Specific Provisions and Assurances. On the LEA Compliance Report, PNP Compliance Self-Check item, the LEA documented the Equitable Services administration amount used and provided a written explanation to all applicable participating programs. The documentation required for the LEA PNP administration amounts for the random validation is Number 1, documentation that the district informed the private nonprofit or PNP officials during consultations of the Equitable Services administration amount and how it was used. That is one way in which the LEA could show that it met the requirement. Or it may submit documentation that it shared calculated Equitable Services administration amounts by program for one participating private nonprofit school campus. Or lastly, the LEA can submit written procedures and documentation that provided verification and tracked LEA PNP purchases that include Equitable Services administration amounts for one participating private school campus. There is not a need to submit documentation for all three of the items that you see listed. Please only submit documentation for one of these bullets, and if you are serving multiple private schools, you would only select one of those private schools that you have documentation for and submit that to meet this requirement. For the PNP administration amounts, the documentation required, again, is the written documentation supporting Equitable Services administration amounts. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status are auditable documentation requested was not submitted. Documentation submitted does not indicate the private nonprofit was consulted on reserved administration amounts, and or documentation does not provide how those administration amounts were used. These are just a few of the issues that may result in an improvement needed status. Thank you for attending the session. If there are any questions following this training, feel free to call or send an email to Lenitra Guest, PNP Ombudsman and Title IV Part A Program Director, or reach out to your local ESC. Thank you and have a wonderful day.